Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. College football playoff matchups are set, taking a deep dive into the Alabama Crimson Tide playing the Michigan Wolverines. Rose Bowl going to be one of the best games that we've seen all college football season long between two of the best teams that we see in all of college football. Undefeated Michigan Wolverines, Big Ten champs going against the SEC champs and the Alabama Crimson Tide. Two of the best head coaches in the country, Nick Saban, Jim Harbaugh. I think a lot of college football fans fired up for this one. Before we get into it, just want to say thank you to you guys. There's just been a ton of support for all of these game breakdowns throughout the season. Getting to the college football playoffs, it's been a blast for us. If you guys do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. And more importantly, let us hear it in the comment section who you guys are riding with for this matchup. We're a month away, but wanted to talk about it a little bit. We'll be talking about it more as the weeks kind of go on, but wanted to dive into it as of right now. Again, appreciate you guys rocking with the fellas. Dale, I'm going to kick this one over to you, and I kind of just want to dive right into this one, and I want to talk about this Michigan offense that has been under scrutiny the last couple of weeks, going up against an Alabama defense that, from a talent standpoint, might be the most talented defense that we see in the country.
And that is the hard part about this Michigan offense, is that if you get the game they played against Ohio State where they were creative, they were able to run it, they threw it, they got it across the field pretty much. Again, we're doing something a little different, it felt like, than what you typically see Michigan do. It's looked fine, but you have seen them go into like a bit of a shell at times. Iowa, Maryland, Penn State second half. And yes, they're doing what they need to do to win these games. But against Alabama's defense, that you need to be creative. You need to do something that kind of puts them in some danger, because just running base offense against Alabama, they're just too good at.
That's kind of what I see too, is like teams that have success against Alabama's defense, they're scheming and they're trying to get some, like Auburn did a really nice job kind of maybe forcing some laps and coverages. Texas also did a really good job. Going up to Alabama and saying, I want our guys to beat your guys straight up, it's going to be really hard because you're looking at two All-American caliber cornerbacks, a defensive line that is probably one of the better units in the country. Alabama is an extremely hard defense to beat straight up. And or teams that have success against Alabama's defense are scheming and kind of testing Alabama's communication in the back end. That's kind of where teams have had success. My biggest concern, not concern, but kind of take on this Michigan offense is Michigan's offense comes to life when they need it. But against Penn State, when Penn State proved that they could just not move the football against that Michigan defense, they didn't need to do anything special. Against Iowa last night in the Big Ten Championship, Iowa had less than, 175 total yards. You didn't really need to do anything sort of special to beat Iowa. But when they do need to do something special like Ohio State, you do see that Michigan offense come to life. The biggest thing I kind of want to talk about here is Michigan, and we said this after the Penn State game, that's probably the best pass rush that we're going to see all year. Well, didn't foresee us playing Alabama in the college football playoffs. You're going to see a really good pass rush with Dallas Turner, Chris Braswell, and a host of other guys. Can Michigan pass protect and give J.J. McCarthy time to push that ball down the field? Probably the biggest storyline of this matchup.
And they're going to have a month to kind of fit this new offensive line together with Zach Sinner, obviously the guy on the Michigan offensive line going down. And frankly, I think they're going to need it, because you're right. In these last couple of games, when Zach Sinner went down against Ohio State, you do notice it's not so much in the run game, but in the pass protection, they have had some moments. And again, you're talking like Iowa's a solid defensive line. They don't have those like horses that Alabama has, those first-round players, that Dallas Turner, Chris Braswell, Tim Keenan, Otis, like those guys who are such high-level difference makers. They just don't have that. So that will be something I think will all be that kind of is it starts and stops with that. If they can be tough enough in that, they'll have a chance to move the ball, but like they're going to need to prove it in a way they didn't prove it, I wouldn't say, in that Big Ten title game.
I mean, even against Penn State, and I think a lot of Michigan fans, we talked about this when you saw guys like Adissa Isaac and Chop Robinson and Denny Sutton, our Michigan tackles as good. Michigan has a phenomenal offensive line, but when they've gone against top-tier edge rushers, like a guy like Chop Robinson, they've struggled a little bit. I'll tell you what, Dallas Turner is as good, if not better, than Chop Robinson when it comes to pinning his ears back and getting after the passer. It's going to be a big storyline, especially moving Carson back into guard. And now you got Trente Jones at that right tackle spot, whether you're chipping with the tight end, whether you're using a running back. you're going to have to try to deal with the guy like Dallas Turner. Second thing I have is, can Michigan and the wide receivers separate? I mean, Terrion Arnold, Kool-Aid McKinstry, Malachi Moore, Caleb Downs in the back end. This is a very good secondary. Most of those guys are going to be playing on Sundays in the next couple of years. Can Michigan separate with their wide receivers is probably the next thing that I'm looking at with this matchup.
And the big thing is if you've been watching Michigan, you know Colson Loveland's the guy. When they need plays, he makes them. I thought Alabama did as good of a job as we've probably seen in the last 2 years dealing with Brock Bowers. And you saw them using guys like Downs. They used Amos. They had a story. They were rotating who he had dealing with them. And all 3-4 guys who really were dealt with Brock Bowers did a pretty good job. He did make some plays, but you also saw a lot of balls go to him in leading to incompletions. And that, again, when you can do that to Georgia, you can stop him. And that's, I think, what you saw with Alabama. So Colston Loveland, A.J. Barner, 2 guys who have been huge for Michigan. Yeah, they're going to need to try to win those matchups against smaller corners and safeties, but guys who have now kind of proven that they can go deal with elite tight ends and what they did against.
And Broward. I also think, you watch that Alabama defense, they like every defense should put a lot of emphasis on Brock Bowers. And if they give Colston Loveland, who I personally think they should kind of give the same treatment, he's one of the best tight ends in the country. Can guys like Roman Wilson, Cornelius Johnson create some separation, win their one-on-one matchups? And the one guy that I think a lot of Michigan fans, especially after the last couple of weeks, saying we got to see a little bit more of, is the true freshman Samaj Morgan, right? If you were going to dedicate a lot of personnel towards a guy like Colston Loveland and leave some space and some green grass to operate for the true freshman Samaj Morgan, you got to get him the football in space. This is a guy that's one of the probably biggest threats on the Michigan offense in terms of hitting that explosive play and making people miss. I'm really hoping that with another month, again, keep in mind he's a true freshman, so it's really hard to get on the field those first couple of weeks. You get a whole month to get his feet wet, get him more acclimated in this offense. I think a guy like Samaj Morgan could be one of those guys when you look up at the end of the game and say, Samaj Morgan might be the player of the game for the Michigan Wolverines.
And also just doing something to change the pace and do something different and be creative. You saw them go to that against Penn State when they were kind of hitting their heads against the wall, and he made a big play for Michigan and kind of changed the trajectory of what was going on. So that's the type of weapon you need to use. You need to get Colston Loveland. He needs to be featured. In Roman Wilson, I want to see have another breakout game where they're getting him down the field. I feel like in the past couple of games, he's been catching a couple balls here and there, but they're within 15 yards of line of scrimmage. I want to see them try to stretch the field a little bit because Alabama has given up some plays down the field.
That's kind of exactly what I was thinking. When Alabama struggled, it's really hard to beat them on a down-to-down basis, right? This is a really good Alabama defense. When you've had success or you've seen people have success against Alabama, Texas, I think Auburn did it. Georgia had some flashes of it, pushing the ball down the field. Maybe especially moving Roman Wilson around, sending him in motion, not letting a defensive back put hands on him. That's when Roman Wilson's at his best. We've been using that the last couple of weeks. Would like to see that. Now, I want to flip sides, talk about this Alabama offense. And the biggest story, we've talked about it the last couple of weeks, is Jalen Milroe went from being a quarterback that was going to – and this is kind of the conversation of why this Alabama team feels different. The narrative around Jalen Milroe after week 3 is he should not be the starting quarterback for the Alabama Crimson Tide. Then you fast forward to the SEC championship game. He was probably the best player on the football field between Alabama and Georgia, 2 of the best teams in the country. Containing Jalen Milroe is going to be a massive storyline. And what I think helps Michigan is they got a month to do it and kind of game plan what they want to do to deal with Jalen Milroe and the quality of play that he's putting on the field the last couple of weeks.
And that's you met Jalen Milroe, but also the offensive line. It's just what Alabama's turned into is what you kind of thought they'd be at the start of the year, where you're not asking your quarterback to move mountains exactly or be the focal. He's still the focal point, but have the type of load that Bryce Young had to shoulder for this Alabama offense. And you saw what that offensive line did against Georgia. That's as good as a college offensive line I've seen play ever in my whole entire life. You saw them knocking defensive linemen over on those double teams, both sides, right side, left side, both very, very dominant, getting a ton of movement in running the ball in that hard, heavy way that, again, you kind of heard Saban talk, I want to get back to physical Alabama football. That game epitomized what they wanted to be. And when they run the ball and look like that, that's that's what you thought they were going to be. That's what they look like. And
talk about Nick Saban and why we call him the GOAT. You take a look at the transformation of this team. Not only Jalen Milroe, I'm happy you brought up the offensive line. This offensive line was a liability through the first 6 weeks. I mean, a straight-up liability. You had a true freshman, Caden Proctor, that really was struggling in pass protection. Then you watched that Alabama offensive line impose their will at many times in that game against the Georgia Bulldogs. Not a lot of teams have done that the last couple of years in college football. Alabama has done that. Not only is Jalen Milroe getting better, I think that offensive line has taken massive strides in the right direction. Alabama runs the ball.
That'll be a really fun matchup, frankly, against Michigan. You saw what Texas was able to do. I think Texas is better up front than Georgia right now. And Georgia's defensive line is really good, but it's not as dominant as it's been in the past few years. Yeah. I think Michigan's defensive line, that's been the unit I think most Michigan fans think when they think what's a dominant group, nationally at Michigan. That defensive line's so good. They get off of blocks. They make a lot of tackles, almost like a stunning amount. And that's what that's going to be that fun, just big time matchup of a lot of NFL players.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's like NFL players on Alabama's offensive line. Pretty much all of the Michigan defensive line is going to be playing on Sundays. That's what you love as a college football fan. Alabama runs the ball 60% of their offensive snaps. That's 12th most in the country. Michigan has only allowed 3 yards per carry to opposing running backs. That's 6th best in the country. So one of the big storylines, can Alabama get that run game going against Michigan? The other thing I do want to talk about is dealing with Jalen Milroe. And I'm not going to get up here and say Kirby Smart and Glenn Schumann didn't. They're a hell of a lot smarter than me in terms of scheming up a defense. 100% admit that. 2 quarterback spies seem like kind of a wild move, because what happened there was, Georgia's rushing with 3 guys. They pretty much are pulling 2 guys out of the defense to deal with Jalen Milroe, and so they don't have a ton of guys back there in coverage. Jalen Milroe had a lot of time to operate, and guys were getting open in the back end. I guess what I'm asking you, and we might not know the answer, Jesse Minter, one of the best defensive coordinators in the country, and this is where I do really think it helps Michigan, is you get a lot of film from Alabama and what they've been doing really well the last weeks, month, to scheme up what you're going to do. And I bet Jesse Minter's in his office right now watching Alabama film, trying to figure out what they're going to do with Jalen Milroe. I'm very excited to see what Michigan does in terms of keeping Jalen Milroe in that pocket and taking his best asset, his athleticism, out of the game.
And frankly, to me, when you've seen Jalen Milroe struggle, it's against elite defensive line performance. Again, going back to what Georgia doesn't have, they don't have those bona fide pros, those first-round picks especially not in the interior. I think what Michigan
Kirby said that heading into the year. He's like, we don't have those game records. You've seen Texas have those game records. I think Michigan has those game records. I'm sorry, I'll let you continue, though, but I do think that's worth pointing out that I do think this will be one of the best fronts that Alabama's had to deal with all year.
And that's what I'm getting into. When you've seen them, Jalen Milroe does hold the ball. I think we all know that. He really does take some sacks that I'm sure Nick Saban would prefer he didn't. He does hold it. And when you can kind of collapse the pocket around him and you have good interior rushers getting through the middle, that is when I think you saw what Ole Miss was able to do in terms of sacking him and being really, really disruptive. And obviously Texas too, it was being able to be very, very good in the middle. And I'd like to think Michigan can play that way. They're Mason Graham, Kenneth Grant, and Chris Jenkins. I think 3 of the better defensive tackles in the country right now. And I like if they can play really dominant against an Alabama offensive line that has gotten a ton better in pass protection. But when Alabama doesn't look great, that offensive line isn't great pass protecting when they look bad. They've been really good, but that's what Michigan's going to need to make them look back to maybe what they did earlier.
Yeah, if you can get, and that kind of goes into the question, was Alabama's offensive line, did it take that many steps forward the last couple of weeks, or have they just not played the Texas Longhorns and some of those other elite defensive fronts that they saw maybe earlier in the season? Last thing I want to talk about is Alabama, and this was a big storyline heading into the SEC championship game, was Alabama sustaining drives, right? A lot of Alabama's offense, because I guess going back, Texas A&M definitely exposed that Alabama offensive line as well in terms of the pass rush. But when Alabama's had a lot of success on offense, they're hitting the explosive plays to a guy like Jermaine Burton, Isaiah Bond, whoever it may be running kind of free down the field. Tommy Reese has done a really good job scheming up some of those deep shots, and Jalen Milroe throws the deep ball extremely well. Can Michigan kind of force Alabama to work the ball down the field and kind of take away that deep shot is going to be another story. And you look at this Michigan secondary, it's about as experienced and as talented as you'll see a secondary in all of college football, right? You got a grad transfer in Josh Wallace. You got one of the best cornerbacks in Will Johnson. You got about as experienced of a cornerback in Rod, or safety back there in Rod Moore, Mikey Sandstrom. This is a Michigan secondary that only gives up 5.8 yards per pass attempt. That's top 5 in the country. And then you're looking at an Alabama team that's one of the most explosive passing attacks in the country. How do you see that battle in terms of Alabama trying to hit the explosive play and Michigan trying to take it away playing out?
Well, I just don't see how you get a ton of explosives on Michigan. It's so experienced. They're so good. You saw them really put the roof, if you will, on an explosive Ohio State team, and I get it. I think Jalen Miller is playing a lot better than Kyle McCord, frankly. But in terms of wideouts and explosive plays and the ability to go get them, Ohio State, they do. I mean, they have Marvin Harrison. He is that kind of guy, if you will. So I think Michigan should be able to do a good job with it. I think to me, the real question is if kind of getting to what I think Michigan can do. If they can stop the run, I think they're in a pretty good spot. My only question is like the way Alabama's offensive line is playing right now and how physical and how hard they're playing. Like that to me is the ultimate question. Because I think if Michigan can do that, I think they can mostly contain Jalen Milroe. I don't think he's, again, like what you saw in the A&M game or Texas game, when they don't run the ball particularly well, he doesn't play particularly well.
That's when you see them struggle. Like if Michigan can stop the run on first and second down, an Alabama offense that, again, runs the ball 60% of their plays, and force this Alabama offense into those third and long situations where you're pinning your ears back, you're bringing in the spot, you're playing that zone coverage, eyes on the quarterback. That's where you're probably going to see Alabama struggle the most if they do struggle on offense. At the end of the day, I mean, this is two of the most talented, experienced, best coached teams in the country squaring off in the Rose Bowl. Still, Michigan 2-point favorites in the Rose Bowl. How are we feeling?
I mean, you see the hat. I can't be objective. I'm sure the Alabama fans respect that. I would expect nothing less from them. I would certainly think they should be hammering the +2 or not +2, but the Bama money line.
This is one of those games where if you're an Alabama fan, you feel good. If you're a Michigan fan, you feel good about this one. Dill obviously going with Michigan. As a Michigan fan myself, I'm going to go with Michigan as well. But most of all, as a fan of the sport, how fired up do you have to be for Alabama-Michigan Rose Bowl matchup? Going to be electric. Again, appreciate everyone supporting the boys. Would love to hear what you guys think in the comment section. Let us know if you do enjoy the content. Consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll talk to y'all later.